happy to be with you guys to talk about presidential legacies at the White House. Just real quick, I want to tell you a little bit about the White House Historical Association, where I work. So we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-governmental association. We were founded in 1961 to help the public learn more about the history of the executive mansion. And what we really do is help the White House to acquire new artwork. We help to preserve the public rooms of the White House, and we help to use the White House as a lens for learning about the history of the United States. And so all of this stuff we do as what we call the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History. And all of these different things that we do with different public lectures and field trips and resources that we provide to teachers are a way of protecting the legacy of the White House, which is what we're here to talk about today. So before we get too far into that, let's make sure that we know what we're talking about. What does this word legacy mean? Let's hear somebody at, which school wants to answer? Let's look at Barrow Elementary. Can somebody there talk about what does this word legacy mean?
Like passing down generations.
Yeah, say it louder.
Passing down generations through generations.
Great, yeah. So I think that a great way to think about this word legacy is that it's just something that is left behind to be passed down to future generations. That's great. That's a really simple definition for what we're talking about today. A legacy is something that's left behind for the future generations. So we're also talking about the White House today. So what is the White House? That may sound like a simple question, but somebody give me an answer to that. How about somebody who's up there at Case Elementary? Can you tell us what is the White House? I see some hands.
White House is what I think means kind of like where the president lives.
Right. What else happens at the White House?
It's where the president makes laws and stuff.
Yeah, that's really close. Okay, so he doesn't actually make the laws. It's a different branch of government, the legislature, who's really responsible for that. But he carries out the work of being president. So this White House is the building where the president works and lives. And a lot of times in the news, especially, we'll use this term White House as sort of a shorthand to talk about the president himself or to talk about the executive branch. But for us, when we use the term White House, we really are talking about the building itself. So for us, if we're going to talk about the legacies at the White House, we're really talking about what's left behind for future generations in this physical structure of the White House. So everybody's good on that? Yeah, thumbs up from everybody? Good. Great. Okay, so we're good on legacy, we're good on White House. So if we are going to talk about a president whose legacy can be seen in the physical building of the White House, we got to go all the way to the beginning. We've got to go all the way back to this guy. You recognize that guy? Everybody, yes? This is our first president, of course, right? This is George Washington. This is, in fact, a really important portrait of George Washington that was done by Gilbert Stuart in the last year of Washington's presidency.
Joanne, I don't think your slides are coming through.
Oh, no. Well, that's why you don't know who I'm talking about. I don't look very much like George Washington, which I think is probably a good thing. So let's see. What do I need to do here to show you guys my screen so you can see what I'm talking about? Share that.
There you go.
There we go. There we go. Whoops, let's not do it like that. Do it like that. Hey, how about that? You recognize that guy? Now everybody recognize that guy? Yeah, there we go. All right, so that is our first president, George Washington. And as I was saying, this is a very important portrait of George Washington that was done in 1797, the last year of Washington's presidency. And this portrait actually hangs inside the White House, but George Washington never lived in the White House. Did you guys know that? He's the only president who never lived in the White House. But even so, he actually left a very important physical legacy at the White House, which is the White House itself. So in 1790, Congress passed this thing called the Residence Act, which decided that we were going to build a permanent capital along the Potomac River. And George Washington was going to have the authority to decide where the president's house would be. And so he chose this architect and engineer whose name was Pierre Charles L'Enfant to plan out the city. This is an early drawing of L'Enfant's plan for the city. The whole city was going to be drawn within 10 square miles of what was at that time just farmland. And inside, here's another drawing. This is actually the earliest drawing that we have of L'Enfant's plan. Inside this plan, L'Enfant left a space for the president's house. This is an up-close version of that. Do you see up there in the left-hand corner, there's this space that's marked off for the president's house? L'Enfant, yeah, everybody sees that. L'Enfant actually, he wanted that space to be about 5 times larger, and he wanted to call it the president's palace. But George Washington and some of the other people who had just fought this war against England, against having a king, decided that that wasn't going to be right for this new country because they weren't going to have a king, and whoever was going to be president was going to be a regular guy. They were going to be one of the best guys you could get, but they were going to be a regular guy, not a king. And so this person wasn't going to live in a palace, and they decided to just call it the president's house. And they reduced the size quite a bit. So L'Enfant laid out this whole plan, but he didn't actually design the house. George Washington got his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, to announce a contest. This is pretty exciting. They announced a contest. They put it in the newspaper that anybody in the country could submit their plan for the design of the president's house. And George Washington would pick whichever plan he thought was the best. So we actually only have a few plans remaining of those that were submitted. We do know that Thomas Jefferson actually submitted a plan himself, but he did not win. According to legend, there was only one plan that George Washington even liked a little bit, and it was submitted by this guy. His name is James Hoban. He was an Irish-born architect. And this is the plan that he submitted. This is part of the plan. And it has several different rooms of different sizes that would be suitable for different size gatherings of people. And George Washington just loved this plan. And so in 1792, they broke ground and began construction on the president's house right there along the Potomac, what would come to be called the White House. They constructed this building until 1800 when it was finally ready for John Adams to move in. He was actually the first president to live in the White House. So before we move on, I can tell you guys we're pretty sad about Thomas Jefferson, that he didn't win the contest. Jefferson actually did okay for himself. Don't worry about him. But he did, when he was president a few years later. This is another one of Hoban's drawings from that time. Jefferson got to work on adding these colonnades out to the side of the White House. Do you see these long, they almost look like hallways out to the side of the building? Jefferson got to work on those with another architect when he was president. These were added in 1807. So Jefferson did get a chance to try his hand at designing some parts of the White House. Do you guys have any questions so far about this first physical legacy that's really the first main construction of the White House?
Brandon.
To ask, what president was Thomas Jefferson?
Loud. Wait.
What number?
What you said is what number president was Thomas Jefferson? That's a great question. So our first president was George Washington. Our second president was John Adams, who was the first to live in the White House. And our third president was Thomas Jefferson. Great question. Anything else?
Okay.
Since Thomas Jefferson was president, why didn't he remodel it himself once he was president?
Can you guys see me now? Yeah. So that's a really interesting question, especially considering that Thomas Jefferson, not only had he been interested in designing the White House, but he designed his own home in Virginia, Monticello. Yeah, he was a pretty talented architect and designer all around. So it is kind of interesting that once he moved in, he didn't decide to sort of mess around with more stuff. I think that the answer to that, to your question about why Jefferson didn't sort of start over, might get answered by the time we get to the end of our talk today about different changes that have been made to the White House over 200 years. Okay, so hang on to that question and see if we answer it by the time we get to the end of this, okay? All right, anything else before we jump forward?
If I can't pronounce it right, but did Abraham Lincoln ever live in the White House? Because he was considered a president. So
Abraham Lincoln was our president. He was our 16th president. That's absolutely right. And he did live in the White House. Yeah, absolutely. He lived in the White House for a little over 4 years. Yeah. While Abraham Lincoln lived in the White House, there were not any major changes. In fact, let's jump back in and talk about some of the other major changes to the structure of the White House. So get back in here. All right, so The next big change happens because, where are you? Because of this. Can you guys see this? Oh, I don't think it's going forward. When you guys see this, you're going to like it, I swear. Hey, can you guys see that? What is going on in this painting?
I know what happened. So I think I've heard about this on YouTube and other places, but I think it's from when we attacked Canada and they came back and burned down the White House.
You are right on track there. Okay, so this is what's going on. It's 1814, and we are back at war with the British. We just cannot stay out of trouble with them. And that war was kind of complicated. It sounds like you know a little bit about it. I'm going to leave it to your teacher to get the details nailed down about that. But so one of the major things that happened is that the British troops came to Washington, D.C., and on April 24th, 1814, they go throughout the city setting things on fire. They burned the Capitol building, they burned the Treasury building, and they burned our White House. So this is actually a painting that was done much later. This painting is from 2004, but I think it's a pretty accurate artistic representation of what that might have looked like. Because what happened is that everything in the interior was destroyed, and all that was left standing was these walls on the outside. So there were lots of people in the Congress who said that maybe we should just start over. Maybe we should rebuild this house from the ground up, and maybe we shouldn't even build it in the same place. Maybe we should take this whole city and rebuild it in some other place entirely. Maybe we should scrap this whole idea of having the Capitol in Washington, D.C. But that's when President James Madison ensured his legacy at the White House by rebuilding the president's house on the same ground, even using the same plans. He even brought back James Hoban to work on the job. So the new White House, the newly reconstructed White House, was ready for James Madison's successor, James Monroe, to move back in 1817. So I don't know if you guys were paying close enough attention, but do you remember how long the initial construction took? If they started working on the construction in 1792, and the first president to move into the White House moved in 1800, how many years is that? Just hold up your fingers to show me how many years it is. From 1792 to 1800. Hold up your fingers to show me how many years. Awesome. I see everybody with the right answer. That's 8 years. Perfect. So this second time that they rebuilt the White House, and they had to do a lot of work to rebuild it, they did it in just under 3 years. So that's pretty impressive. But they took some shortcuts. They rebuilt some things that should have been done with brick. They used wood instead. And they did some other things, sort of the fast way. And just think about that shortcut. Keep that shortcut in your mind, because I think it's going to come back up to get us a little bit later. So keep that in your mind. During this reconstruction, we're actually going to see the north and south porticos, those sort of porches that go on either side of the White House. This is a view from the side of the White House, so you can see on the north, there's that one porch that comes out to the front, and on the south, there's that one porch that comes out to the back. This was actually an idea that that Latrobe had when he was working with Thomas Jefferson. So again, we see some of Jefferson's ideas showing up here, even though somebody else is carrying them out. Okay, so things stay pretty much the same, with only some minor changes until this family moves in. So everybody look at this family. This family moved in 1901. This picture was taken a little bit later in 1902. This is President Theodore Roosevelt. When he came into office, he was the youngest president ever to become president. Do you see how many kids he has? He's there. His wife is there. But I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I count 6 kids. That's a big family to move into the White House. Check this out. This is one of my favorite drawings that we have in our collection. So on the second floor of the White House, which was always intended to be both, as we said at the very beginning, always intended to be where the president would live and work. You can see right up there at the top of the drawing is the offices for the president. And all of those other rooms are different bedrooms for the people in the family. So what do you think it was like if you were a person who was coming to do business with the president, if you had an appointment to come and visit the president? What was it like for the family?
Yes, Robin.
It's crowded.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It was super crowded. And on top of that, these Roosevelt boys were known for being very rowdy. They would sometimes do things like take a horse up and down in the elevator. That was no way for the president to do business, right? So this leads to what came to be known as the Roosevelt Renovation, or sometimes called the 1902 renovation. And they did a lot of different things to the actual White House, to the executive mansion. But the main thing was to build a new space for the president to actually do his job while he was living in the White House. And that's eventually what is going to become the West Wing. So you can see over here, this is on the west side of the White House. These were some greenhouses that had been built up over the years. Those are actually going to get replaced by this structure, which would become the West Wing offices for the president. You can see that this structure sort of builds on that idea of the colonnade that Jefferson put in, that sort of hallway out to the side of the main building. Here's another image of the West Wing offices from the South. This is from a few years later. So if I say West Wing, what's the one room that you really think of when I say West Wing or the president's working? Where does the president work?
Executive.
Maybe the
Executive office.
I heard what I'm looking for though. Something about a shape.
The oval. It's an oval.
That's right. I heard it. Yeah, the Oval Office. So, when Roosevelt built this West Wing for these new executive offices for the president, he did not have an Oval Office. This is actually the floor plan. The president's office is that square little office up there in the corner. It wasn't until his predecessor, William H. Taft, that we see the first Oval Office. Here you can see that the floor plan with that shape. That's what we think of as the president's office, right? The Oval Office. But actually, it didn't even get moved to its current location. That's what it looks like essentially now until FDR's presidency. This is in 1934 when the Oval Office actually gets moved to where it will still be today. So, any questions at this point, you guys? We got one more big period to talk about.
no.
You have any questions at Barrow Elementary?
Albert. Loud and proud, come on.
How many people in total have ever lived in the White House?
Can you ask that one more time? How many people do what at the White House?
How many people have ever
Lived in the White House?
Oh, how many people have ever lived there total? That's a good question. Well, we have had 44 presidents. Our president right now is president number 45, but that's because we had one president who was president 2 times non-consecutively. So we've had 44 different people who have served as president and lived in the White House. All of those presidents have had different family members who have lived with them. And then there's sort of this staff that also lives in the residence with the president and the first family. So, you know what? I really wish that I could give you a good answer to that question, but I just don't know because that's a big number and not one that I've actually thought about before. Does anybody else have a question?
Okay.
Who's the guy who y'all talking about that moved the Oval Office?
Say it again.
Who's the guy who moved the Oval Office?
Office. So the first guy to actually use that round space in the West Wing as an Oval Office was President Taft. Yeah, and that was in 1909. And then the president who actually moved that round office sort of to the corner of that building and still used it as an office, that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was in 1934. Yeah? Anything else?
Why is the White House called the White House?
That's a good question. So the White House is white, and it's not because it was painted white to cover up the burn marks. That is not true. Do not let anyone tell you that. It has always been white, and it's actually because of the kind of stone that was used to build it, and the sort of the whitewashing that is used to seal that stone. And it had sort of been called, it was called the President's House officially, but it had sort of been called the White House off and on all along. It was Teddy Roosevelt, again, our man who added the West Wing. He was the one who officially started calling it the White House. So that was during his administration, probably around 1901, 1902, when he started calling it the White House. Good question. Okay, we ready to finish up? Yeah? We got one more renovation to talk about, one more physical legacy at the White House. Let's see if I can share my screen with you guys again. Think it's working. Okay, so this last reconstruction, outside of the original building of the White House, this is the largest construction period of all of them. So it starts with, think back for a minute. Remember when I talked about those shortcuts after the British burned the White House and we rebuilt everything pretty quickly? Remember I said to hang on to that information because it might come back up? This is when it comes back up, okay? So on top of that, over the years when they made small changes to the White House, like when they put in plumbing or they put in electricity or different things like that, those things had actually damaged the structure of the White House in small ways that added up over time. It didn't help that things had been done, like Coolidge added a third floor on top that the building just couldn't support. So when Harry Truman moved into the White House in 1945, he could tell that the building was in trouble, but he still wanted to do what all of his predecessors had done. And he really wanted to build a balcony on the south portico. So once they started this project, it didn't take long to recognize that a full reconstruction really needed to happen on this building. And in 1948, Truman appointed this whole commission for the renovation of the executive mansion. And they decided that all they could keep was the outside walls. They needed to gut everything inside this building. So check it out. This is them on the outside of the building figuring out what they needed to do in order to save the White House. This is them on the outside. They built 2 basements to go underneath the White House. This is in the inside. You can see they had to gut everything. They really took everything out. Very famously, they had to take apart some of the equipment to get it inside and then rebuild the equipment inside in order to tear some things apart so that they could keep the walls on the outside but tear apart everything on the inside. So this whole project took 4 years in order to sort of keep the iconic walls on the outside, but rebuild the inside with steel supports so that it could stand up to the modern needs of the house. The Trumans actually lived across the street for the whole time that this project was going on. They lived at Blair House, which is normally where guests of the president stay. And so this is a stone that is actually in the entry hall of the White House. It's right there in the floor. And these dates you probably recognize because these dates are 1792, when they started construction at the White House, 1817, when they finished that major project rebuilding after the British burned it, 1902, when Teddy Roosevelt had his big renovation and added the West Wing, and 1952, when Truman finished this huge project that rebuilt all of the insides of the White House but kept the outside of the White House because he recognized, just like those other presidents had, that this building was such an important symbol to the country that they needed to make sure that they kept as much of the building as they could, even though they needed to make some important changes to make sure that the building would still support all of the work that needed to be done there. And that's our White House as it looks today. All right. Okay, so those are the physical legacies that we are going to talk about today. What questions do you guys have?
Or
Are the White House in Washington D.C. or okay? That's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Hayden, loud and
Is the White House haunted?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, the short answer is it depends on who you ask. There have definitely been some people who have reported feeling certain things when they've been there. And I think, you know, that's the best answer I can give you on that.
Any questions from Case Elementary?
yes.
How long did it take to build the White House?
The first time when they built it for the first time, that's a great question.
Yes.
So they started construction in 1792, like we talked about, and it was finished enough for John Adams and his wife Abigail to move in the fall of 1800. So that's 8 years. But a lot of the stuff on the inside really wasn't finished until even 1820. During the Jackson administration in the 1820s is when really we would say that initial construction period was finished. But we really say that it was ready in 1800, but a lot of stuff still had to be done, even when those first residents moved in. Good question.
Let's go back to Barrow Elementary. You guys have any other questions?
Loud and proud.
How many presidents have
Guys, let's.
What was the question?
No, Logan.
Logan asked a question. Are you in the White House right now?
I'm not in the White House right now. I'm in an office building right now. That's 10 blocks from the White House? Matt, is that about right?
Sounds about right. Maybe a little less.
Something like that, yeah.
One more question from Barrow.
How many girls have never been elected for president?
Say it again.
How come girls have never been elected for president?
That's a great question. So this past election, the election of 2016, was the first time that a major party had actually had a candidate that was a woman. But you know, it's only been just under 100 years since women have even been allowed to vote in federal elections in this country. So, you know, I think there are a lot of people who think that it's been a long time coming, and there are a lot of people who also look at that timeline and think that there's just been such tremendous progress made. I think that those are both valid ways to look at that question. I also think that the best way to ensure that we have women elected is to encourage women to run. So it could be someone in that classroom right there.
How about Case Elementary? Do we have another question from you guys?
How many people did it take to build the White House?
Ooh, that's a good question. Lots. There were lots of laborers involved in that. Some of those would have been enslaved men and women. Some of those would have been hired laborers from the surrounding community. Some of them would have been some skilled stonemasons who were actually visiting from other countries. But there were just numerous people involved in the construction of that house.
Okay, back to Barrow. Do you guys have any questions?
Last one, Travis.
Are we gonna get to see Trump?
Not during this presentation, no.
Kirsten.
Who was the secretary of Teddy Roosevelt?
His personal secretary, one of his cabinet secretaries, or
His personal secretary.
I don't actually have that information. That's a really good question.
Okay, one more from Case. Do you guys have any more questions?
What state is Washington, D.C. in? Because around like the northeast coast, there's a bunch of small states, so I don't really know.
So Washington, D.C. is not a part of any state. It is its own separate federal district. So it's sort of, it is a federal territory. It is not a state. It has some of the qualities of a state, but not all of them. For example, it does not have the same representation in Congress that a state has, but it does have some of the same responsibilities that a state has. This is actually something that you'll probably get to in your civics class when you get to studying some of these different things. So I know that we're getting close to running out of time here, but I want to leave you guys with a question. And it's sort of that question that one of you asked very early on before we got deep into this, which is, why is it that at all of these different periods, different presidents have left their legacy at the White House by choosing to stay, by choosing to make renovations or to rebuild on the same space? What message does that send to the people in America or to people in other countries about our White House and about our government and about our country? What does it say about us that this house is something that we will rebuild instead of starting over?
Any answer to that, Barrow?
Casey.
Do you work for the
No,
president?
the answer to that question. Albert.
It could be because they don't want to spend the time that they've already used and wasted the time that they already did make the White House work. So we're just going to.
Okay, is there another way to look at it?
Alessandra.
It's leaving a good impact on the whole United States and it's making our representation better as we're not going to give up just on something that was ruined. We're going to rebuild it and keep trying.
Yeah, I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Anybody at Case want to offer any answers?
maybe like the legacy might be like they were a good president, or they might want to think that the other countries to think that America's a good place.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely see that.
This one.
Any other thoughts from you guys before we sign off?
You've got a hand up at Case.
What type of like exotic animals have been in the White House? Like, has a pig or any type of animals like that as a pet have been in the White House other than like a cat or a dog?
That is a very interesting question. There have been some exotic animals at the White House. Some of them actually, going back to our friend Thomas Jefferson, he kept some bear cubs at the White House. He had a parrot at the White House. John Quincy Adams actually had an alligator at the White House. There are a lot of interesting pets that have been kept at the White House. And actually, if you want to go on our website, there's some more information about that you might want to check out. Some cool stories about different pets that have been kept at the White House. Cool. Okay.
Any last questions from Barrow?
Bobby.
Who should pick our president? Yeah, take that.
One more time.
I think that was who's your favorite president?
Oh, my favorite president. I'm not supposed to have a favorite, but I do. And it's Teddy Roosevelt. And it's not necessarily because of the things that we talked about today, but it is definitely because of just the energy that he had and that he brought to the office. And I think that the way that he was sort of an interesting mix of always being committed to what he believed in, but at the same time willing to sort of have his mind changed by compelling arguments. So yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, he's my favorite.
I see one hand up high at Case. Maybe one last question.
Question. We haven't had to ask.
Was Obama, since you like your favorite president is Teddy Roosevelt, then in the 2017 election, who did you vote for?
I think I heard something about a 2017 election.
Yeah, I don't know if we can answer this one. Who did you vote for in 2017?
Well, 2017 was not a big election year here in Washington, D.C., actually. It was an off election year. There were only local elections that were held here. So you probably wouldn't know any of the local offices that I voted for. But I wouldn't share with you even if you would, because I'm here as a non-political representative of the history of, as we said, the legacy of the White House. So I think that's as good a place as any for us to wrap up. I'm so glad that I got to spend some time with you guys this morning and talk about the White House. There is lots more stuff on our website, whitehousehistory.org, including teachers, a lot of classroom resources that you may be interested in checking out. Right now, we actually have a really great photo story about the Truman renovation if you wanted to see some more about that. And as I said, there's lots of cool stuff about White House pets throughout the years. So yeah, thank you guys so much.
Bye.